I still remember the day I came across that book. It wasn't a grand moment filled with music and bright lights. In fact, it was quite ordinary, quiet, almost forgettable to anyone else. I was wandering through a small bookstore, the kind where the air smells faintly of old paper and history, and my fingers were tracing along the spines without really looking for anything in particular. Life was moving, but I was stuck. Not in a dramatic way, just in that subtle, heavy way where each day feels like a repetition of the last. I wasn't searching for a miracle. I wasn't even searching for answers. I just needed something to break the monotony, even if it was a distraction. Then my hand stopped on a book that I'd never seen before. There was nothing flashy about it, no bold colors, no promise of overnight success on the cover, but there was something about it, something quiet yet magnetic, that made me pick it up. I flipped it open without much thought, and my eyes fell on a random page, just one sentence, one line. And it was as if someone had reached into my chest, found the part of me I had been ignoring, and spoken directly to it. I can't explain why those words hit me so hard. They weren't dramatic, they weren't dressed up in poetic flourishes, but they were true. And truth, when it finds you at the right moment, doesn't need decoration. It cuts through everything. I stood there in the middle of that aisle, reading that single sentence over and over, not because I didn't understand it, but because I could feel it shifting something inside me. It was as if the book had been waiting for me patiently, knowing I'd eventually arrive at this exact moment in my life. I bought it without hesitation, not even checking the price. On the way home, I felt this strange mix of anticipation and skepticism. Part of me thought, it's just a book, don't get carried away. But another part of me, quieter, deeper, whispered, no, this is different. That night I opened it again, starting from the very first page, and within minutes I was somewhere else entirely. The outside world faded. My phone stayed untouched. The clock stopped existing. I was immersed in a conversation with someone who seemed to know me better than I knew myself. What struck me wasn't that the book was giving me entirely new information. It wasn't teaching me some hidden formula or revealing secrets no one else knew. Instead, it was awakening things I had always known but buried under the noise of everyday life. It was reminding me of truths I had conveniently forgotten because they were uncomfortable to face. It was challenging the excuses I had built so carefully, and it was doing all this with such simplicity that I couldn't hide behind the usual defense of this is too complicated for me. There's something almost magical about that first encounter with a book that speaks to your soul. It doesn't feel like learning, it feels like remembering. As I turned each page, I could feel pieces of myself returning, like puzzle fragments I didn't even realize were missing. I wasn't just reading, I was having a dialogue. The author would lay out a thought, and my mind would instantly respond, yes, but what about this? And somehow, as if anticipating my question, the next paragraph would answer it. It was uncanny, almost eerie, as though the book had been written for me alone. Looking back, I realized that moment was a turning point. Not because I finished the book in one sitting or because it instantly solved all my problems, it didn't. The change began with something much smaller, almost imperceptible awareness. Awareness that I was not as powerless as I had convinced myself to be. Awareness that I had choices even in situations where I felt trapped. Awareness that my mind was capable of more than I had been asking of it. And all of this began with one chance encounter in a bookstore, with one sentence that cut through the fog I had been living in. I think we underestimate the power of the first spark. We think transformation has to come from dramatic events, major turning points, or big decisions, but sometimes it's as subtle as a few words on a page catching us off guard. We read them and suddenly the way we see the world and ourselves shifts, even if just by a fraction. That fraction grows. Over time it becomes a new perspective, a new way of moving through life. What made that moment even more profound was that it didn't feel forced. I wasn't in a self-help seminar, I wasn't searching for guidance, I wasn't being told what to do. It was just me, a book, and a sentence that refused to leave me alone. That's the beauty of it. You can't predict when or where the spark will come. You can't schedule it or manufacture it. All you can do is stay open enough to recognize it when it happens. The truth is, I could have walked past that book. I could have picked it up, read the sentence, and put it back on the shelf. I could have told myself I didn't have time to read. I could have been too distracted, too busy, too skeptical, and if I had, I would have missed the chain reaction that followed. But I didn't. I listened to that quiet pull, and it led me somewhere I didn't even know I needed to go. And maybe that's what I want you to remember, that sometimes the smallest moments hold the most life-changing potential. You don't always see it in the moment. You might not even understand why something resonates with you so deeply. But if something stirs you, if something speaks to you in a way you can't explain, pay attention. That's not an accident, that's an invitation. Because you never know, that one line might be the beginning of the chapter that changes everything. When I truly began to read the book, it didn't take long to realize that what made it powerful wasn't just the sentences printed on the pages. Yes, the words mattered, but there was something more, something hidden, almost woven into the spaces between them. It wasn't simply telling me a story or offering me a set of instructions. It was quietly building a bridge between my thoughts and a way of thinking I had never considered before. It's strange how the mind works when it meets something that resonates. You think you're just reading, but in reality, the words are unlocking doors you didn't know existed. I would read a paragraph and it would plant a seed, something small, something I couldn't quite name. Hours later, while I was walking or even just making tea, the meaning behind that paragraph would bloom in my mind, revealing a deeper truth that hadn't been obvious when I first read it. That's when I realized this wasn't just a book, it was a conversation with a part of myself I'd been ignoring for years. The beauty of it was that it didn't try to force its lessons on me. There was no arrogance in its tone, no demand that I believe everything I read. Instead, it asked questions, not always directly, but in a way that made me stop and think, what do I truly believe about this? And sometimes those questions didn't have easy answers. Sometimes they were uncomfortable. But those were the moments I knew I was actually growing, because comfort rarely changes us. What struck me even more was how much of its wisdom lived in the unsaid. The spaces between the sentences seemed to hold as much weight as the words themselves. It's as if the book understood that the reader's mind is not just a container to be filled, but a fire to be sparked. It didn't hand me a neatly packaged truth, it let me discover it piece by piece in my own way at my own pace. I remember one particular night I was halfway through a chapter that seemed simple on the surface. It was about making choices, not the big, obvious choices we all recognize, but the tiny ones we make every day without noticing, the ones that seem too small to matter. The text didn't list them out or give me examples, it simply left a line that hinted at the weight of these moments, and then it moved on as if assuming I would catch it. I closed the book and sat there in silence, realizing that so many of the patterns in my life, the things I blamed on circumstances or luck, were actually the result of those tiny choices I'd been making unconsciously. This is the kind of teaching that stays with you because you're not being told what to think, you're being shown how to think. And once you've learned how to think in a new way, you can never go back. That's why this book became more than ink on paper. It became a mirror, reflecting back the parts of me that I had overlooked. It became a guide not by leading me step by step, but by showing me the terrain and letting me decide the path. I think the reason it had such an impact was because it didn't try to be loud. So many voices in the world are shouting for our attention, promising quick results, instant change, effortless success. But this book was different. It whispered, it let the reader lean in, not because of a promise, but because of a connection. And in that quiet space, the most profound lessons revealed themselves. As I kept reading, I began to notice that my mind was working differently in my everyday life. A conversation with a friend would spark a thought, and I'd remember something I had read not as a quote to repeat, but as a perspective to consider. A small challenge would arise, and I'd feel this shift in my thinking, as if I had more room to breathe, more tools to work with. I wasn't just applying the lessons of the book, I was seeing the world through a new lens. And here's the fascinating part. It wasn't only me. When I began to share little pieces of what I had read with others, they too would pause, just like I had in that bookstore. They'd take in a simple sentence and then fall silent, their eyes showing that something inside them had been stirred. That's when I realized that what I had found wasn't mine alone. The book wasn't designed to create followers, it was designed to awaken leaders in their own lives. The more I reflected, the more I understood that this was the difference between information and transformation. Information can be copied, memorized, repeated. Transformation has to be lived, and it always begins with an internal shift. This book wasn't telling me to change, it was helping me see why I wanted to, and that's why its lessons lasted. It reminded me of something I'd once heard, that the best teachers don't give you the answers, they help you ask better questions. Every time I thought I had absorbed all it had to offer, I'd revisit a chapter and find something I had missed before. Not because the words had changed, but because I had. The more I grew, the more the book revealed. I think that's the mark of something truly life-changing. It grows with you. It never stops offering value, because it's not just about the content, it's about the connection you have with it. And when that connection is deep enough, the lessons live in you long after you've closed the cover. Because some books you read and forget, but others, they read you back. And those are the ones that change you forever. As I went deeper into the book, something began to happen that I hadn't expected. At first I thought it would be all inspiration and uplifting words, the kind that make you feel good about yourself. But the more I read, the more I realize this book wasn't interested in just making me feel good. It was interested in showing me the truth, and the truth, as I discovered, isn't always comfortable. In fact, sometimes it can be painfully confronting. There were moments when I would read a sentence and instantly feel a sting, like the words had exposed something I'd been hiding from even myself. Not because the author knew my life, but because the ideas were universal enough to slip past my defenses. It was like holding up a mirror that didn't just reflect my appearance, but my intentions, my excuses, my hidden fears. And I'll be honest, my first instinct was to look away. That's the thing about real growth, it rarely feels pleasant in the moment. We say we want to improve, we say we're open to change, but deep down, most of us want that change to come without discomfort. This book didn't give me that option. It didn't allow me to stay in the safe corners of my mind. Instead, it kept inviting me to step into the light and actually see the parts of myself I had ignored. I remember one particular passage where the author spoke about the stories we tell ourselves. Not the stories we share with others, but the quiet ones we whisper in the privacy of our own minds. Stories like, "I'm not ready yet," or "It's just the way things are," or "I've already tried and it didn't work." Those lines hit me like a punch to the chest because they were my stories. They were the invisible walls I had built to keep myself from stepping into the life I said I wanted. And here they were, written down in black and white, exposed. It was a strange feeling. Part humiliation, part relief. Humiliation because I could no longer pretend those patterns weren't mine. Relief because if I could finally see them for what they were, maybe I could start changing them. That's the gift and the challenge of being confronted with the truth. It robs you of the comfortable lies you've been living in, but it also hands you the opportunity to create something real. The deeper I went, the more the book began to act like a skilled guide, never attacking, never shaming, but also never letting me hide. It showed me where I was living small, where I was letting fear dictate my choices, where I was blaming others for things that were really within my control. And each time I had a choice, close the book and retreat back to my old ways, or keep reading and face the discomfort. I kept reading. Not because it was easy, but because somewhere deep down I knew the discomfort meant I was breaking through something. It's like a muscle. If you never push past what's comfortable, you never grow stronger. And in the same way, if you never allow your beliefs and habits to be challenged, they'll never change. This book wasn't just giving me knowledge, it was giving me a mirror that made it impossible to keep pretending. I think that's why so many people shy away from the kind of material that truly transforms them. It's not because they can't understand it, but because understanding it means they can no longer deny their own role in their circumstances. It's easier to stay blind than to admit we've been standing in our own way. But here's the thing, once you see yourself clearly, you can't unsee it. And that's a blessing, even if it feels like a burden at first. Over time, I began to appreciate the honesty of the book. It didn't try to sugarcoat reality. It didn't promise me that life would suddenly be easy. It simply showed me that I had far more power over my choices than I had been willing to admit. And that realization alone was enough to start shifting the way I approached my days. I stopped waiting for the right time and started taking small steps in the direction I wanted to go. It also made me think about how rarely we give ourselves the gift of honest self-reflection. We fill our lives with noise, distraction, and constant motion so that we never have to sit still long enough to face ourselves. But the book forced me to slow down. It demanded that I ask the hard questions: what am I avoiding? Why am I really making this choice? What story am I telling myself right now? And even when the answers were uncomfortable, I found that facing them gave me a strange sense of peace. Because the truth is, there is nothing more exhausting than living in denial. Carrying lies, especially the ones we tell ourselves, is heavy. And when you finally put them down, you feel lighter. That's what this book gave me, the courage to put them down. It taught me that growth isn't about adding more motivation, more skills, more possessions, but often about letting go of false beliefs, outdated fears, and the narratives that no longer serve us. And you can't let go of what you refuse to see. The day I realized that was the day I stopped fearing the mirror the book held up. I started welcoming it, because I understood that every time I faced something uncomfortable in those pages, I was stepping closer to becoming the version of myself I was meant to be. And that version wasn't hiding, wasn't making excuses, and wasn't afraid of the truth. Because the truth, no matter how sharp it feels in the beginning, is always the first step toward real freedom. When something truly touches your soul, it doesn't stay with you, it moves through you. That's what happened after I finished the book. At first I thought it was just my personal experience, my private journey, something unique to me. But as the days turned into weeks, I found myself talking about it in small ways, almost without realizing it. A sentence would slip into a conversation with a friend. A perspective I had learned would guide the way I gave advice. The ideas began to weave themselves into my daily interactions, and I started noticing something remarkable: people were responding. It wasn't like I was quoting entire passages or preaching its message to anyone who would listen. In fact, I wasn't trying to convince anyone of anything. But when you truly internalize something life-changing, it changes the way you speak, the way you listen, the way you see the world. And people can feel that. They may not know what shifted in you, but they sense the difference. I remember one evening sitting with a group of friends. Someone was sharing a challenge they were facing, and instead of giving the same generic encouragement I might have given before, I drew on a lesson from the book, not word for word, but in essence. The room grew quiet as they processed it. One of them looked at me and said, "That really makes sense. I've never thought of it like that before." That's when I realized this wasn't just my journey anymore. The book had planted seeds in me, and now I was unknowingly planting them in others. From there, it started spreading. One friend asked me to recommend something they could read. I handed them my copy of the book, and a few weeks later they told me it had shifted their perspective in ways they couldn't fully explain. They passed it to another person, and the same thing happened. Soon this single copy had traveled more than I had, touching lives I would never meet. What fascinated me most was how differently people connected to it. One person would latch on to a certain chapter that I had barely noticed, while another would be deeply moved by a single sentence that I had read without much thought. That's when it hit me. The power of this book wasn't in telling everyone the same thing. Its power was in meeting each person exactly where they were. And when something meets you where you are, it has the ability to reach deep, even into places you didn't know needed light. I began to hear stories. A colleague told me they had started making small, courageous changes at work because of something they read in it. A friend said it gave them the courage to have a conversation they'd been avoiding for years. Even someone I barely knew messaged me to say that a quote I had once shared on social media without even mentioning the book had been the spark they needed to turn their life around. That's when I realized the reach of this message was far beyond my control. And that's the beauty of ideas. You can't contain them once they find a way into people's hearts. They move from one person to another, sometimes directly, sometimes in ways you'll never see. A thought becomes a conversation becomes an action changes a life, and that life changed goes on to change others. It's a ripple effect that doesn't ask for permission. What's even more incredible is that this ripple effect doesn't just stop at inspiring people, it reshapes them. And when they change, the people around them have to adjust to that change. A person who suddenly believes in themselves will influence their family differently. Someone who learns to take responsibility for their choices will start expecting more from those around them. Without even realizing it, the lessons keep expanding outward, touching people who never even heard of the book in the first place. I think this is why certain works, whether books, art, or even a single act of kindness, become timeless. They're not bound to one audience or one era. They contain something universal, something that fits into the human experience no matter where you are in life. That universality makes them portable. You can hand them to someone across the world in a completely different situation and they'll still find something in it that speaks to them. Looking back, I see that the book was never meant to just sit on a shelf, collecting dust after one person read it. It was meant to travel, to live, to breathe in the minds of everyone it touched. And the truth is, once an idea has transformed even one person, it never really stops moving. That transformation becomes visible in the way they live, the way they speak, the way they carry themselves, and that visibility is contagious. Sometimes I wonder about the people who held that book after me, the ones I never met. I wonder what they took from it, what parts of it became part of their lives. I wonder who they shared it with and how far it's gone by now. There's something humbling in knowing that you're just one link in a chain that started long before you and will continue long after you're gone. It taught me that influence doesn't always come from grand gestures or loud proclamations. Sometimes it starts quietly, with a single idea whispered to one person who then carries it forward. The person sharing it might never see the full extent of the change they've inspired, but the change still happens. And maybe that's the most beautiful part. You don't have to witness it for it to be real. Because once an idea has been awakened in someone, it has the potential to travel farther than any of us could ever imagine. And this book, it's still traveling. One thing I've learned over time is that inspiration by itself is never enough. It feels good in the moment. It can light you up like a spark in the dark, but if you don't do something with it, that spark eventually fades. How many times have we all read something powerful, heard a moving story, or attended an event that filled us with determination, only to find ourselves back in the same patterns a week later? It's not because the message wasn't true. It's because inspiration without action is like wind in a sail without a boat. It moves nothing. That's where this book stood apart. It didn't just leave me feeling uplifted. It left me with the uncomfortable realization that if I didn't put its ideas into practice, I was wasting them. It wasn't asking me to just nod along in agreement. It was asking me to get up, move, and change something. At first, that was difficult. There's always that temptation to stay in the warm glow of thinking about change instead of actually changing. Thinking feels safe, acting feels risky. But page after page, the book kept drawing me back to one truth: nothing changes until you do. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how many areas of my life I had been leaving untouched simply because I was content to understand them but not transform them. I remember one particular chapter that spoke about the danger of becoming a collector of wisdom. It described people who consume books, podcasts, and seminars endlessly, yet their lives look the same year after year. They feel productive because they're learning, but they mistake accumulation for application. That hit me hard because without realizing it, I had been doing exactly that, stacking up ideas in my mind like trophies, while my daily actions remained unchanged. That was the moment I made a decision. For every piece of advice I took from the book, I would do at least one thing differently. Not someday, not eventually, immediately. Sometimes it was a small change, like waking up earlier to create space for deep thinking before the day swallowed me whole. Other times it was a bigger leap, like having an honest conversation I had been avoiding for months. It wasn't perfect. Some actions worked, others didn't. But even when I failed, I felt more alive than I had in years, because at least I was moving. The book had shifted me from a passive consumer of inspiration to an active participant in my own growth. And that's a transition I believe everyone must make if they truly want transformation. The more I practice this, the more I notice something: action breeds clarity. You can think about a decision for months and still feel uncertain, but the moment you take a step, even a small one, the fog begins to lift. You learn what works, what doesn't, and what adjustments to make next. The book didn't just encourage this, it demanded it. It refused to let me stay comfortable with knowing, it pushed me toward doing. I saw this happen in others as well. Friends who had read the book began to share their own action stories with me. One started pursuing a side project they had been talking about for years. Another finally left a job that had been draining them for far too long. None of these actions were without fear, but each one created momentum, and momentum has a way of multiplying. Once you start moving in the right direction, even slowly, it becomes harder to stand still. And this is the crucial difference between people who are moved by a book and people whose lives are changed by it. The first group treats it like an emotional experience, beautiful but fleeting. The second group uses it as a blueprint and a catalyst. They refuse to let it sit as a memory, they let it become a habit. The book also taught me that action doesn't have to be grand to be meaningful. We often wait for the perfect conditions before making a move, thinking that change must be big to count. But in reality, small, consistent actions are far more powerful than occasional bursts of effort. You don't have to overhaul your entire life in a week. You just have to do something today that moves you forward, and then repeat it tomorrow. Over time, those steps compound into something extraordinary. I began to see every piece of wisdom in the book not as an idea to admire, but as an invitation to act. And when you start living that way, you stop separating learning and doing. They become one. Every lesson becomes a choice you can make right now. Every insight becomes a door you can walk through today instead of someday. There's a certain energy that comes with this approach. You stop waiting for the world to give you permission, and you start giving yourself permission. You stop talking about what you want to do and start building it brick by brick. And even though there are setbacks, and there always are, you realize that forward motion feels infinitely better than standing still, even if the road isn't perfect. In the end, I believe that's why this book continues to impact thousands of lives, not because it makes you feel something for a moment, but because it compels you to do something that changes the trajectory of your life. And once you've taken that first step, it becomes much harder to go back to doing nothing, because action, once awakened, refuses to sleep again. Some books fade from memory almost as quickly as you finish them. They serve their purpose in the moment, maybe give you a new thought or two, and then they quietly slip into the background as life takes over again. But then there are others, rare ones that seem immune to time. You can close them for years, come back to them, and still find them speaking to you as clearly as the first time, maybe even more powerfully. This book was one of those. The reason, I think, is that it wasn't tied to trends, buzzwords, or the fleeting problems of a single moment in history. It didn't depend on a certain cultural moment to be relevant. It was built on something far deeper, principles of human nature, the kind that have been true for as long as people have been people. It spoke to the fears we hide, the hopes we carry, the struggles we try to make sense of, and those things don't expire. They are as real now as they were 100 years ago, and they will be just as real 100 years from now. Every time I revisited its pages, I noticed something fascinating. I was reading the same words, yet they didn't feel the same. It wasn't the book that had changed, it was me. I had lived more, failed more, learned more, and because of that I could see things between the lines that I had missed before. It was like the book was alive, waiting for me to grow into certain truths before revealing them. That's the hallmark of something timeless, it grows with you. In the years since I first read it, I've gone through moments of joy, loss, uncertainty, and success. And in each of those seasons, I could open the book and find something that felt like it was written exactly for that moment. Not because the words magically shifted, but because they were layered in such a way that they could meet me at different points in my life. That's the power of writing that comes from truth. It can adapt to the reader's stage without losing its essence. I've also seen how the impact of the book doesn't weaken as it's passed along. I've met people who read it decades ago and still speak about it with the same light in their eyes as someone who discovered it yesterday. That's not just nostalgia, that's the enduring relevance of ideas that don't depend on context to matter. The language might be simple, but the principles are ageless. It made me realize that we often chase what's new, thinking that freshness is the same as value, but freshness fades quickly. Truth doesn't. You can package it in different ways, use different metaphors or examples, but at the core it's the same. This book didn't try to impress with novelty, it focused on delivering truth so deeply rooted that time couldn't shake it. Another reason it hasn't faded is because it doesn't pretend to be a complete map of life. Instead, it offers a compass, a set of directions that you can keep coming back to no matter where you are. That means it's not a book you finish in the traditional sense. You carry it with you. You might not even open it for months or years, but its voice stays in your mind, quietly influencing your choices, your thinking, your way of seeing the world. And perhaps most importantly, it isn't about the author. The real genius of it is that it keeps the focus on the reader. It doesn't ask you to adopt someone else's life, it asks you to see your own more clearly. That's why it works for so many people in so many different circumstances. It's not a prescription, it's an awakening, and awakening never goes out of style. I think about how easily certain books get lost in the noise today. There's so much content, so many voices competing for attention, that even brilliant ideas can get buried. But this one refuses to disappear because it doesn't compete. It simply waits. People find it when they're ready, and when they do, they feel as if they've stumbled on something rare, almost sacred. And once you've felt that, you can't forget it. In the end, what makes a book like this live on isn't just the quality of the writing, it's the depth of the connection it creates. Once it changes you, even in a small way, you become part of its life. You talk about it, you pass it on, you live out its lessons, and through you it continues to move. That's why it doesn't need to fight for relevance. It's kept alive by the very people it touches. Some things in life are meant to be temporary, a song that fits a certain summer, a phrase that helps you through one tough week. But every once in a while, something comes along that feels like it was built to last, not because it resists change, but because it's built on the very things that don't change. This was that kind of book. And maybe that's the greatest gift it gave me, the understanding that the truest wisdom doesn't need to be replaced. It doesn't age, it doesn't fade, it just waits for the next person to be ready to hear it. And when they are, it feels brand new all over again.